Welcome. My name is Nan McFadgen. I am the president of CUPE Nova Scotia. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are hosting this webinar on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. To set the tone of our space, I would like to read the equality statement, recognizing that all of the attendees are not CUPE members, but this is recognized as a CUPE space, so we'd like to read our equality statement. Union solidarity is based on the principle that union members are equal and deserve mutual respect at all levels. Any behavior that creates conflict prevents us from working together to strengthen our union. As unionists, mutual respect, cooperation, and understanding are our goals. We should neither condone nor tolerate behavior that undermines the dignity or self-esteem of any individual or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. Discriminatory speech or conduct which is racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic hurts and thereby divides us. So too does discrimination on the basis of ability, age, class, religion, language, and ethnic origin. Sometimes discrimination takes the form of harassment. Harassment means using real or perceived power to abuse, devalue, and humiliate. Harassment should not be treated as a joke. The uneasiness and resentment that it creates are not feelings that help us grow as a union. Discrimination and harassment focus on characteristics that make us different, and they reduce our capacity to work together on shared concerns, such as decent wages, safe working conditions, and justice in the workplace, society, and in our union. CUPE's policies and practices must reflect our commitment to equality. Members, staff, and elected officers must be mindful that all persons deserve dignity, equality, and respect. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce Elle Jones, an activist, writer, and an artist. She will be our moderator for this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nan. Good evening, comrades. Good evening, everyone. It's so great to be here together and with our panelists, Calvin Scott, Donna McCarthy, and Yolanda McClean. So they're going to be speaking tonight, and a big welcome and thank you all so much for giving of your time and talking about this important issues. So this is a really important time for CUPE. I am a CUPE member. I'm a member of 3912, the part-time academic union. And as those of us who are members of CUPE know, in this, the largest union in Canada, many of the frontline workers, the workers, teachers in education, people working across transport, communication sectors, people in healthcare. There's many people that are CUPE members whose lives are affected by this COVID pandemic. And so many people, and many of the people on this chat and members were directly affected by many of the social issues that were intensified and revealed by COVID. So we know that during COVID, there was a big class gap and a social inequality gap between who was home safe and who went out to work on the front line. So whether that's people in the transport industry, people that were essential workers, many of those again are CUPE members. So many people experience that fear every day of going out and doing your job and not knowing how that was going to affect your family, whether you're going to get infected, whether you would live through that. So we recognized in that the social gaps and social inequality that existed between who was kept safe and who was doing the work. We also know at this time, of course, you're in a time of great upheaval in these global protests around Black Lives Matter, which are also about deep issues of social inequality. So Black Lives Matter, of course, which begins with George Floyd and the officer kneeling on his neck, Derek Chauvin, for almost 9 minutes, but of course is also a tinderbox for these deep racial power dynamics that have existed over and over again. So we know that there have been racial justice movements before. Of course, the original Black Lives Matter movement starting in 2013. Before that, we know the many upheavals, the Rodney King case. We can go back into the 60s. Every few years, of course, we know that these issues come back. And we also know that in Canada, we tend to distance ourselves from these issues of race, pretend that they only exist in the United States, and then act newly surprised every time we are confronted with an issue of racism. So particularly in Canada, it's like, here we are experiencing racism. Again, what a shock. So whether that's Trudeau wearing blackface or every few months, whatever it is, we are always newly surprised. But this affects unions. So we know that this is an issue in Canada, and we know it's an issue for workers, Black workers who suffer not only the pressures of the economy, the pressures of poverty, the pressures of work, but also added that to racism, both within our jobs and also within our union. So the places that are supposed to protect us are often the places that when we go for help, we don't get that help, or even worse, we find that, you know, the white person who may be bullying us or threatening us may actually be getting that union protection. So it opens up a lot of questions, and that's why it's extremely important that we're here today having this difficult discussion, this uncomfortable discussion, but one that is needed to have. So along with understanding the problems of racism that exist in workplaces, the experiences of Black workers, and sometimes the failures of unions in that and what unions can do better, we also have some models of solidarity in this moment that I think are also very much worth pointing to. So in Minneapolis, one of the examples we have from workers is that bus drivers refused to, for example, transport protesters to the jail. So bus drivers simply said, we will not be doing that. We will not be participating in these arrests. And as workers recognize their solidarity. There was a letter that went around that many healthcare workers and people in other sectors signed. So union workers saying that being in solidarity with Black Lives Matter meant also doing things like making sure you treated protesters, not allowing the police to bring protesters to the hospital and then, you know, collaborating in acts that may further the police goals there. So we saw a lot of workers, not just mouthing Black Lives Matter, but actually standing up and saying, I understand that my job is very deeply implicated in this moment, and I'm going to take some real solidarity. So we know that when workers, racialized people, when we stand together, we know that is extremely powerful. So we also want to, in this time, think about what is the role of unions? How can unions in this moment stand in stand together? What is the responsibility? And how can we build more solidarity in our unions, in our workplaces, and in our communities to not just talk about Black Lives Matter, but to build the real change that we're talking about? Because of course, we are not just talking about racism, we are talking about really deep power structures. The conversation around defunding the police is very much about the distribution of wealth. Where we put money, do we put it into punishment, or do we put it into healing our communities? Do we care for each other, or do we simply want to incarcerate each other, police each other, survey each other? Why do we have all kinds of money for increasing police budgets and so little money for assistance, for medication, for the needs of life? So that conversation is very much one around social equality, and one that impacts all workers, because we are all, of course, paying taxes, contributing to this economy, and we have a right to say where our money goes. So thinking about those budgets and thinking about that money also involves thinking about these issues. So those are some of the very, very important issues we'll be engaging today. Those will be my introductory remarks. I'm very, very excited to be here as a union member, as a precarious union member. So from my own experience, as part-time faculty, we are, of course, the first cuts in institutions. We're the ones at universities are saying 30% of part-time positions are going to go. And of course, we know that women are concentrated in these precarious positions, and particularly women of color are concentrated in these positions. So in my union, that raises a lot of questions around how do we protect precarious workers and racialized workers in this moment where universities and institutions are making decisions around what money they think they have. And so our unions have to fight in solidarity with us to preserve our living at the same time as we are, many of us, out in the streets protesting and actually putting our bodies on the line. So that is my own experience. So I share this personally as a CUPE member and the things that are impacting me right now. And the other people on this panel will also speak about their experiences. So I think that's enough introduction from me. I'm going to introduce, so I'm going to re-say the names of our panelists. So we have Calvin Scott, who's sent it in the screen right now for me, so give us a wave. Donna McCarthy and Yolanda McClean. So welcome everybody. And the first question is going to go to you, Calvin. So the first question for, well, really everyone actually, let's start with everybody. So everybody can go perhaps in that order. During these difficult times, how are you all feeling? How are you coping? Have your lives changed? What's going on for you right now? So Calvin, you can start.
Okay. Hi, tell everyone out there. Nice to see you. My name's Calvin Scott. I've been an African Nova Scotian support worker for the past 20 years for the Halifax Regional School Board. And it's hard to follow Elle. She said everything, summed up everything so eloquently. So I'm kind of nervous about doing that. But speaking from the heart, how I'm feeling, I guess I'm feeling kind of confused and motivated at the same time. And I say confused because I look at the times that we're going through and the global protests like Elle alluded to, and it's a very transitional time in our history. And if we don't take notice to that and really take action, we're just.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, Calvin, you've frozen. Can we get you back? Uh-oh. Calvin, you might have to sign out and come back in.
Lifetime that I'll be
Oh.
going through such a pivotal and transitional moment that affects my people so deeply and impactful. So that's how I'm feeling right now.
Okay, Calvin, your connection isn't great. So I don't know if that's, if you can move somewhere, if it's just your internet. But
It must be the internet. It must be.
You're freezing a bit. So let's hope that stays. But thank you so much for your answer. Donna, how about you? How are you feeling in this time? What are you experiencing?
I guess for me, it's very similar to Calvin, but from a different perspective. Obviously, it's terrifying. A lot of things are terrifying. It's when you see what's happening on the news, and like you said, we get surprised all over again when you see horrific murders and you see this stuff. But I'm also feeling hopeful, and I think that kind of fits with what Calvin was saying about being motivated. As you said, this has been ongoing for years, whether it was the 60s, whether it was with Rodney King, you see these movements coming, but somehow this one it feels a little different for me. It feels stronger. It feels like it's not going to go away, which gives me hope. Quite frankly, just some hope that this one might be the one that makes the difference for people. Which I should also say, I am terrible for laughing when it's not something that's funny. I have a nervous giggle. It doesn't mean that I'm making light of it. That's how I get through life. Laughter and tears is what sees me through. So yeah, please don't consider it disrespectful. I laugh when I'm nervous. But yeah, I'm a little bit hopeful. I think the pandemic absolutely put everything under a microscope, and I think people are going to come out stronger on the other side. I think it's made it because they need a connection. It's allowed people to connect in better ways, and so yeah, as much as it's scary and the other stuff, I feel hopeful. I feel that the movement has some momentum.
Thank you, Donna. And of course, Yolanda, it's you next. How are you feeling?
Well, first I want to thank CUPE Nova Scotia. So you're all jumping around the computer, so my eyes are moving where your bodies are moving. So but this technology is great because I am in Toronto, Ontario. So it's great to be connected with so many folks across Canada. So thank you for inviting me to join this panel. And I also want to acknowledge the Mississauga New Credit that I'm on and that land that you're all on. So thanks, Nan, for doing this, and thank you to the ancestors for sharing your land with us, especially those of us who came here as settlers and allowing us to share your space. But I also want to recognize the shoulders that I lean on from the Atlantic slave trade, my ancestors, and I pay honor to you, and thank you for giving me the strength to do this work that I do. And I mean, that's how I'm going to begin by saying that's exactly how I feel without that strength. You asked me how I feel during these difficult times. Well, I'm going to repeat what folks said: sad, angry, and at times, believe it or not, yeah, I actually have a bit of hope too. And sometimes it seems far and few between, but I know that we can make a difference. These difficult times that you're referring to, they're daily lived experiences for Black communities. And of course, it's my experience as a Black woman. And racism, including anti-Black racism, exists prior to COVID. So it's hard because like we went through this in life, and then we go through this during COVID. And some would say that COVID exposed racism to the world, when in fact, this is not the case. Racism was heightened during this time of the pandemic as people were watching and noticing. And reports and articles and social media posts started pouring in with like the anti-Asian hate and the reports and stats of the disproportionate healthcare for Black and Indigenous and other racialized people. We moved into the senseless police killings of Black and Indigenous peoples, and the over-policing with force and community members like Santina Rayo, a young Black woman from Halifax, comes to my light right now. But all this continues to fuel feelings of anger and frustration and rage.
But let's be clear, racialized workers are now considered to be essential workers. Like, we're so important, healthcare sector, food services. I come from CUPE, so of course it's public sector and cleaning services. And these are the workers that have to risk their lives to go to work and put food on the table, decide whether they're going to get on the bus or not. So this leaves myself and Black communities getting hit twice with violence in our country, which started our movement of justice. And that's why I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because our Black communities are joined by people from around the world. I'm telling you, people have never raised their voices, people have never marched, people who are now in conversations at the table. Children haven't been going to school, so now they're talking to their parents and asking questions and finally getting a response. So that's why I feel hopeful now, because the conversations around the dinner table consist of what kind of stability and sustainable changes are definitely possible. So we can't stop writing, we can't stop talking. Every time I feel down, I'm going to be lifted up, because I know we can't stop doing this work. This is a historical moment, not just for us as people, but historical for under the leadership of Nan in your region. Just having this panel makes me hopeful, because this was never happened before, a historical moment for sure.
Thank you, everyone. So one of the commonalities in that answer is how complex the feelings are in this time and how many different forces there are. So both the hope that we feel, but also, of course, the deep rage and anger, the despair, the tiredness, but then also the possibility of building a new future, which is, of course, what the labor movement was formed for, and what it's always been about is this collective work and this understanding that if we all come together, our voices will always outweigh the forces of oppression. But getting there is, as we know, a much more difficult journey than just the saying. In theory, an injury to one is an injury to all. In practice, we know it's been a bit different. So that does bring us to what's a very difficult conversation. As we have this conversation, I want people to keep in mind that people who are sharing personal experiences of racism, that is very, very difficult. Black people don't, wake up in the morning and feel like, I get to pull the race card today. It's gonna be exciting. It's very, very difficult. It can be re-traumatizing. It can lead to backlash. So I ask people who are listening to that chat to this chat to be very, very mindful of what it takes to share these experiences, to listen with an open mind, to not get defensive, to not have your first reaction be like, but my union, or I wouldn't do that, but to understand that the first step is to really, really listen to people's experiences and to take them seriously, and to understand that people don't talk about racism lightly. Nobody just makes an accusation of racism because we think it will be fun. So with that said, Calvin, this is the order. You may have picked up on the order. So Calvin, you said you work in the educational sector, and of course we know that schools are a huge site, especially for our youth, where they're experiencing a great deal of racism, whether that's the curriculum, the conversations around policing in schools, suspensions, all of those things really affect our kids. And you as a worker are also involved in that space. So what racism have you witnessed in your union, and what kind of experiences have you had while you're doing this work?
Well, I must say, it's not blatant racism that I experience overall. It's a lot more subtle, a lot more verbal that goes on within the unions. Basically within other members not knowing who you are, what you do, in your position, and always questioning your value and your worth. That's the overwhelming theme that I always get from other members in my union. And also the question, I'm an African Nova Scotian student support worker. The positions were built and housed for African Nova Scotian youth, because of representation in the schools weren't there. So I always get questions from other members, why can't I apply? It's right in the title. It's African Nova Scotia Student Support Worker. So the barriers, it's very subtle. There's blatant, but you have to look at the representation. When you look at union members, who's in the union, who's in those power positions in the union, what type of policies are going to come out from the people being able to vote and make an impact on those unions. And we're not there, from my experience. And just ignorance, a lot of ignorance, I find, that comes out.
And I know you didn't prepare for this question, but I just wanted to ask you briefly,
Sure.
in your work, obviously you probably have to explain to youth sometimes what they're experiencing. So how do you go about talking to youth in these times or before this around the experiences they're having? And what kind of pressures does that put on you as a support worker, where you both want these children to be successful, but also need them to understand the realities of what they're facing?
Well, I echo the realities. It's all about reality. It's no fluffing. I have to tell them exactly what's going on, explain to them how to, present themselves in the world, how they're going to be presented and perceived in the world, how to interact. The questions are constant. Like every day, I can go into, I'm at Halifax West High School, and it's a very diverse high school. However, sometimes the students of African descent don't feel represented in that school, no matter how diverse they want to cloak, how, they want to make it seem so diverse. But it's a constant. I just tell them the realities, basically, prepare them, let them know who they are, the greatness they come from. Don't let the history books dictate your future and your vision of your power, basically, because you can get an education in the school, but you can go outside and get really educated about who you are.
Uh-oh. Calvin is frozen again. These are the problems of online. Somebody mentioned that they're really glad about the accessibility that's available, and that's very true. Oh, we have Calvin back.
Sorry about this. My computer is going wacky today.
There's no problem.
Sorry
Go ahead.
about that.
Were you finished?
Yes, I am. Yes, thank you.
Okay, the last question I wanted to ask you is, what barriers do you find exist that make Black members feel unwelcome in their unions? And how can some of those things be changed?
Oh, some of the barriers. It's representation, basically. People of African descent don't see themselves represented in the unions, I find. They go to meetings. If you go to a meeting, I go to meetings, I don't see anyone in the meetings that I usually attend that look like me, and that's always a barrier for me. It's uncomfortable. It's trust issues. There may be a situation where you had to talk to a union member about a certain situation at work, and they just don't see it from your perspective, and it causes problems that way because it always seems like they're siding with the power structure. That's from speaking with people that I've talked to about in barriers.
Do you have any suggestions for union members on what could maybe be done differently?
Yeah, I think go out and talk to each other union members. Just don't talk to your own collective category of work program you're in. Talk to other members within that region. Like, I'm a support worker, talk to EPAs, talk to caretakers, just talk, speak. It has to be an educational process here. It's been too long where unions, and also, sorry to go off track, but historically, unions weren't very friendly and welcoming to people of African descent as well. They outright disbarred them throughout North America. So there's a lot of history behind why people don't want to be involved with unions and some of the barriers.
Thank you, Calvin. And thank you so much for persisting through these connection problems. Donna, I'm going to turn to you. And I know that when this panel was being planned, there were even questions around, is there a place for non-Black voices right now? Should this be an all-Black panel? And we did think that it was very important for white members to also take responsibility to talk about racism. It's not just a Black problem, right? Racism is a shared problem. And so you very generously agreed to be on this panel, but I also wanted to highlight for people that that was a conversation that we had around what would this look like and what kind of role would non-Black voices be playing. So for you as a non-Black person, what anti-Black racism have you witnessed in the union?
Yeah, it's funny. The first thing I was actually going to speak about was the elephant in the room. I'm a white woman on a union panel for anti-Black racism. That's a good place to start. And like you said, we did have the discussion. I was actually, I had reservations of putting myself out there as the nice white lady sitting on the panel. And I had said that I wouldn't do it unless people agreed, which of course you all very kindly agreed. But one person's words stuck with me when we were on that meeting. I won't name the individual. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, but one of the people on the panel, when we talked about whether or not I should be here, said that my voice might help to give their voice some credibility. Sorry. I just want to reflect on that for a second. My white voice may give one of these Black voices more credibility on a panel about Black racism in the union. This hurt my heart. It almost made me back out. I was kind of ready to say, this is not okay. This is not what we should be sharing. But then I realized that they're probably right. This is their lived existence. And if my being out here and being willing to take the criticism for being the white lady on the panel can help reach one person, then it's kind of my responsibility to step in and do that. So here I am. The other thing I want to start with, of course, is acknowledging my own racism. And I know as soon as I get off this, I'm going to get calls from people who know me who might be watching to say, Donna, you're not racist. But the reality is I am. I'm a white woman raised in white colonial society, and that means I'm racist. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean I'm not trying. It doesn't mean I'm not educated. It just means that I've been told a single story of Black people from mainstream media for the majority of my life. And because of that, it means I have biases. So I need to check those biases often and continuously and try to continue to improve myself. And I hope people call me out. I promise I won't ever get defensive because without acknowledging it, I can't change it. I can't grow and improve. As a side note, the single story is not my words. If you ever get an opportunity to watch a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, it's fabulous. Back to the question though. my husband says I'm great at making short stories long. Obviously, I've seen racism in the union. All one needed to do is be at national convention when we talk about diversity seats. And without going into detail, just hearing what people are at the mic saying, people that are supposed to be our social leaders, people that are there as a union voice. And when they get up to the mic to say things, when you talk about diverse seats, it's heartbreaking. In fact, our last national convention, we actually had a lady who got up to the mic. She had just been called the N-word. It was shocking to us. Again, you know, nice, polite white Canada. We don't expect that stuff to be here. I will give credit to our president, our national president, Mark Hancock, for how he handled the situation. But it was 2019. How is this a situation that even needs to be handled? But like Calvin was saying, in addition to the big stuff that everybody recognizes as racism, we have the harder stuff to recognize, the more entrenched, polite racism. The members who tell me all lives matter and why do they have to bring race into it, or I don't see color, and then proceed to tell me about their Black friends or Black coworkers. Of course they see color, just only when it suits their storyline. And again, as Calvin was saying, Calvin, we're quite blessed. Calvin is a member of my local 5047. And that's another example. And it could be any local, but I'll use mine. We have approximately 1,400 members who come from incredible diverse backgrounds. We even have the job classification of African Nova Scotian student support workers, yet we have an all-white executive, and it's mostly white members who come to our meeting. And again, it's not an insult to the members who come. They're not bad people. We just don't know what we're doing. And to create a safer space, we need more advice. So we need to examine it and recognize our racism to find out what we're not doing or what we need to be doing to make it a safer, more inclusive space.
So you started to address this, but if you could say a little bit more about, from your perspective, and I realize you're not the authority on this as many people, I don't want you to feel like you have to speak on like, do this and this, but from your perspective, your experience, how can people be an ally to Black union members?
It's a big question as well. I guess the first thing we need to do is recognize our own racism, acknowledge what we know, what we don't know. We need to, sorry, my computer just went crazy on me here. So yeah, recognizing our racism, recognize what we know, what we don't know. Grab my notes here. Learn, education. Try to listen. Try to not pretend we know what we're doing, because we don't. If a member comes to you and says, a racialized member, a Black member comes to you and says that something is racist, it is. That's the end of the conversation. We don't get to be part of that conversation to say whether or not something is racist. You know, listen to them, learn, ask questions. How can I help? What do you need? Don't assume to know what their answers are going to be. Make space for their voice. Don't be their voice. Again, though, when making space for the voice, recognizing that they're tired of fighting. We don't know what they've faced when they've tried to have a voice in the past. So if they're not in a place to have that voice, make sure we have a safe way to still have their voice heard, whether they can email someone on the executive to address situations in a safe way, or maybe a suggestion box that someone can leave notes in anonymously, because we definitely want the voices there. We're stronger when we're more diverse. Read the equality statement like Nan did tonight. Every single time we meet as CUPE, we need to read that equality statement and make it meaningful, make it real. We set the tone. Do not tolerate any racism at a meeting. Just be open. Don't be defensive, be open, and when you're called out on things.
Thank you. I want to pause here and say that I didn't do the traditional thing, which was get bios from people and then, you know, read the bios out. And I did that for a reason, because I always don't like it when people do it to me. But I also like us to see people in their own words and in their own way, without this sort of barrier of, oh, I need to know people's credentials, or, you know, somehow I've always felt there's a bit of like, I need to know who you are before you speak, and I want us to know people as they speak. So if people are wondering why I didn't share bios, I just wanted to say that what's beautifully unfolding here is we're learning about people's backgrounds and who they are from their own words and not from something printed. Thank you so much for that, Donna. By the way, if we have time before we move to questions, we might do some rapid fire rounds. So, you know, Calvin and Donnie are not potentially off the hook yet. But Yolanda, I want to turn to you. So my first question for you is, how do you think unions can support Black communities? What can be done? Can unions support Black communities? In what ways?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for the question. And first, I just want to say thanks to Calvin and Donna for your stories. I mean, as many folks know, before you do these panels, you have like the pre-meeting before the meeting, before the actual panel, you know how it goes. Like, and so we did have the pre before the pre. And like, I came to appreciate both of them and the work they're doing, but hearing them tonight brought me closer to you and a better understanding. And no, both of you can't go anywhere. Like, this is the work we have to do together. They need all of us at the table, making space for all of us to make positive changes. And so, like, your comments really hit me in a positive way. So I just want to say thanks for that. And thanks, Elle, for the question. I mean, unions have the power and can provide support and action that will benefit Black communities. I am from the Coalition of Black Trade Unions, which is also a coalition. And I want folks to know that communities, faith groups, unions, parent groups, like, they're all connected. You're guaranteed to find one of each in every group. And that's another way that how unions can actually have the power to support these Black communities. I did write down a list of a few things. I know people want to write things down, so I'm not going to talk too quickly. I just want to list a few because you asked the question. I think that unions need to acknowledge and recognize that anti-Black racism exists. I think that's where we need to start. We need to start where we are. And then unions need to be engaged with Black communities. Every region, every province has, if more than one Black community, gives people an opportunity to share their stories, talk about their experiences and their knowledge. And then unions need to listen and hear and understand their voices. Instead of like them hearing from us, we hear from them and give them the opportunity to share their own stories. I think while I'm got my union hat on too, I always have my union hat on, talking about like updating bylaws to create diversity. Like there's representative positions. I'm the equity rep in my own local, but you can include these things in your bargaining at your local executives. I think inviting famous Black speakers to your events, and famous like Elle Jones, I think is famous enough. I think there's a plug for her. Like I would love to have her as a guest speaker at one of our events, at one of our membership meetings, host workshops. I think educationals for our members are so important, but not just for our members, but joint education with our employers. Many folks are doing it now. I think it's important that we read and share our resources. I mean, there's a great 2 books that I've read. Let me think. Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard, and The Skin That I'm In. I know Desmond Cole, so I knew that book like really, I know that's not the exact title, but I think that that's important. And for those of you that, are busy, don't want to read as much, I think looking at our Black History Month landing page on CUPE National's website is really good. Got some great information there. And while we're like in the sort of like doing this kind of work, we should create and write resolutions that amplify our voices as Black members, and continue to create safe space for Black members, like the Black Caucus that we're having later. I don't want to forget about that. I almost forgot about that one. And putting out, debunking the myths about Black people. Just because, you're wearing a sweater or a hoodie, or you're going for a jog, or you're just standing like on a street corner, doesn't mean that you're a criminal. And maybe we just need to like sort of go back to the basics and write those things down and have those kinds of conversations. CUPE National is supporting our National Employment Equity Campaign. I think those are important because those are like strategies that are real, that we can actually do, that are tangible. We've spent so much time talking about all the things that look good, sound good, but I think I just try to find a list of things that are tangible at our hands, that are doable. I think that we should include conversations about defunding the police and what it looks like. CUPE National just had their board meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we spent, of course, I'm sure there's a national board member on, except Nan on this call. I think we spent like an hour and a half on it. Great discussion, great conversation, better education. I think that's what we have to do as a whole, and support Black businesses. If you can't do any of the above, if you support a Black business and just say thank you for being here, and donating to your local Black organizations and the faith groups, and supporting Black-led events, go and volunteer, or food donations, or help distribute flyers. I think the bottom line is that unions need to stand with Black communities and take a stand against anti-Black racism. Name it what it is, call it what it is, because this is not a conquer and divide sort of thing. This is a way for us to build and have strength to do the work that we do and all that work that's before us. And that's why I appreciate both of you, because this panel is a start where we are right now, bringing awareness to others. When I saw like the list go up from 50, then 60, then 70, that like participants, I'm like, oh my. The interest is not just amazing, but the actual like, what can I do? It was more amazing to me. And so I'm looking forward to our next panel. Oh, no, I won't be on it because we're all nervous. Well, someone else will be on another panel. But these are like more than welcome, and absolutely we should celebrate them and the numbers that we have for sure.
Thank you. And one thing I want to point out here is that you see in the questions around what can people do, those range from the personal to the systemic. Right? So there's a range of things. So people that are in a position to work on more structural issues. So things like, I see a question about collective bargaining, things about executives, but there's also small acts that people are talking about, the language you use, how you treat other people. So I think that's really important to flag, that Things can be larger acts that have a systemic impact, but also can be just smaller acts in how you move around your day. So thank you all for raising those. And Yolanda, another question for you. So as a leader in the largest union in Canada, what message do you have for other union leaders?
Well, I'm going to be frank. I mean, I know I'm glad that we didn't do the bios at the beginning, so it gives us just an opportunity. I am a member. I am working class, frontline worker, come from school board also. But I have to say, I want to thank you for recognizing me as a leader, but most importantly, like a Black female leader in the largest union. Because there aren't many leaders that look like me. And like, that's the conversations that we've been having for some time. And I think that first our union leaders, they have to recognize that Canada is not immune to systemic racism. And leaders must also recognize that anti-Black racism has been alive and well for over like 400 years, 500 years, and resides in all of our institutions, including our unions. Because we're a union member doesn't mean that we're perfect. Because people feel like, you know, we do all this great work, and we do, but we as union leaders still need to come together and find ways to make positive changes, as unions are on the forefront of all of this work. And unions and communities, I said before, they're very much linked together. And leaders not only need not just let this moment pass us by with no real meaningful change, but that, because that list that I gave you above, it's not hard to achieve. So Al, I want to thank you for like dividing it up, because there are like things that leaders can do, things that members can do at all levels of the organization, because I feel that in the labor movement, everyone's a leader in their own way. I think it's important we continue to listen to our Black workers' voices and believe their voices. And open the door as leaders. We have to open the door by creating space in those leadership roles and staffing positions. The National Rainbow Committee, which I come from, the recommendations and the request to support Black lives creating designated positions of all committees, national and regional, we have these conversations all the time. And we said, you know, at some point, it'll be great. I mean, we always talk about quotas. People don't like quotas, but sometimes you have to start somewhere to get something. And I think as leaders, it's good to say we'll have like a minimum of 2 positions in anything like held for Black CUPE members, and a minimum of 2 positions for Indigenous members, because we have to start somewhere. We have to start with an anti-racist organizational action plan. And this also includes the analysis of all union policies and the bylaws to ensure that there's no racial discrimination at any level of our unions. This is not about, and leaders, sometimes I get it too, this is not about us taking over. This is about us sharing the space and working with our allies to make positive changes to dismantle racism, not just for today, but for years to come. And I want us to keep that part in mind also. I think that's really important, because it's one thing to say, I know I don't see leaders that look like me, and that's one thing, but what can we do together to share the space, to have a seat at the table, and not just be the meal at the table, but to actually make the menu. And so I think that's important. And to just conclude, I just want to provide us with like, it's this, this great quote that rings so true in my mind. And for those of you that haven't seen our CUPE National Black History Month bookmark, it's by Rosemary Brown. It's a beautiful bookmark, and it says, we must open the doors and we must see it, that they remain open so that others can pass through. And I've got that quote memorized in the back of my head, because I know that, you know, it's not just for me to be in this position, but it's for me to bring others with me. And it's for all of us leaders to bring others with us that look like us into this space.
I leaned down when you were talking just now, because somewhere I have my CUPE Rocky Jones bookmarks, but I don't know where they went. There's somewhere on this table. I was like, can I see them and try and like just pull it?
Yes.
I'm not that slick to be able to reach to it. Thank you so much, Yolanda. Something else that I think is really important to flag is that, and this, I think a lot of our comments have sort of talked around this, is that Black people also occupy multiple identities. You can be a queer Black person, you can be Afro-Indigenous, you can be a Black person with disabilities, right? So I think it's also really important to understand, and those things can also intersect. So to also understand the importance of understanding that Black people also hold multiple identity positions. All Black people are not the same. And Black people may be in multiple places. So you often get this idea of like, oh, like if you're on the LGBTQ committee, but you're Black, right? So I think that's also really important to acknowledge those multiple identities. We do have some questions. So, okay, but I'm gonna make more work for Don because I can't scroll back in the chat, and you so helpfully put the questions into the chat, and now I can't see them. So can I get a copy and paste on that so I can begin to ask these questions? I'm trying to talk slow to give this time to happen. Nan's breaking in.
I'm doing it. Just give me 1 second.
And while we're waiting, I want to thank the panelists so much so far. This has been, I think, tremendously inspiring. From the comments in the chat, you can see that people are really listening, committing to learning, which is really important, you know, asking for resources. So you can see that people are really engaged with what you're saying. So thank you so much for taking this time. Okay, here we are, back to the questions. Woo. Okay, so the first two questions are related. So one is, how can we build capacity in our unions and executives, specifically in education? Are there resources that would help executives? So particularly around, specifically in the education sector, I guess. So Calvin and Yolanda, perhaps maybe take this first.
I'm still having, but could you repeat that? I'm really sorry.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So the first one is, how can we build capacity in our unions and executives, specifically in education? Are there resources that would help executives? So I think that's also around like the whiteness of unions in the education sector. So perhaps we could also expand that to be like, what kind of education do unions need in order to build that capacity as well?
I think that would be a start.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have trouble again?
No, we've got you. Go ahead, Calvin.
So you didn't hear anything I said?
No, but now we can hear you.
Oh man. Okay, let me see if I can remember it now. Now I think it's a good start would be for members of, if you have African members of African descent as union members, have them liaison with executive members, have little committee meetings and so forth. They have to bounce off a couple of ideas on how you can better incorporate the two unions coming together, or the two members coming together to recruit more people. Like I say,
Oh no, it's so unfortunate that we keep losing Calvin. This internet is anti-Black. That's a good one. Okay, perhaps Yolanda, and then Calvin's gonna come back and speak right when you start speaking. Oh, here's Calvin. Sorry, Calvin. This is so awkward.
No, go Yolanda, go. Yolanda should go.
Okay.
Every time I speak, it seems like I'm having trouble.
I totally get it. Oh, no worries at all. I mean, I think when you talk about education, I mean, I did mention a couple of things, but I think it's important that folks realize, like, just because I'm in this skin too, there are lots of us that don't believe like anti-Black racism like exists either. Like, we're not, and all of our intersectionalities, it doesn't mean that like we've arrived. And there are, so when people talk about like, how do you get buy-in from like your executives, our executives and our members, we have lots of folks that are on the same page, but we still have lots of executive members that are not on the same page. And education comes from different levels. I mean, yes, I think, you know, there are training courses that CUPE has. I saw that Tammy put that in the chat. I think that was really, really important. Like those quick modules, those 3-hour, like racism in the workplace, how to, dealing with homophobia in the workplace, how do you deal with like conflict resolution? Because, you know, this could be conflict for a lot of people, and it doesn't like name anti-Black racism, but it does talk about other areas that actually impact people's minds. I think membership meetings are also a good way to start. Like the subtle, like not to like throw it into people's faces at the executive, but sort of have like a speaker come in, to have a performer come in, like spoken word. People accept things differently. Some visual, some by reading, some by like theaters. Like, I think this is a way to sort of like get folks educated, not just by like us having these panels, which is important, but in different areas and different mechanisms. I think another way to do it, like if not through schools and so forth, to get executives on board, and that's not the right word, but to get them sort of like, to get them to understand better, is like every single meeting should have a quote that sort of makes people think, because they're subtle. I mean, and Donna said it well. I mean, Donna said, yeah, I'm a white person in the skin. Like, you know, there are a lot of folks who actually don't, who believe folks like Donald Trump and believe our own governments and think it's okay. And if we don't have this kind of like positive education now, when election comes, and we have to put like our like money where the ballot is or whatever, or like put our ticks on the whatever to change the face of what it looks like, those are going to be our challenges. So I think starting small around education is really important.
Thank you, Yolanda. Donna, I don't know if you want to jump in. There's another related question around the kind of training for executives, but also implicit bias training, whether it exists. So I think a lot of people are interested in the kind of training out there. Yolanda addressed a lot of it, but I don't know if there's anything to add, either Donna or Calvin again. There's a second question, so around resources to educate oneself, particularly around systemic racism, unconscious bias. And there was a related question also about whether there's implicit bias training or what kind of training exists.
Yeah, yes, we do have steward learning series training, which I definitely recommend. How to be an ally is one of the great 3-hour ones that that we can do. And I don't know if any of you have, obviously Yolanda probably has, but I don't know if Calvin or Al or anyone listening has attended any of the training. But they're facilitated more. It's not that didactic learning. It's not someone standing up in front and just shooting things out at you. It's more of they phrase the question and then you have the conversations. So every time you go, even if you've taken a training, go again, because the conversation is going to be different depending on who's sitting at that table. But the other side of it is, especially as the white ally, educate yourself. It's really not that hard to type in a Google search and read the information, look at the stories. Take a moment to do the research. It's not your black friend or your black member's job to educate you. Take the initiative, put some energy out there, and go out and find the training yourself. Find some things. It's educate yourself around what our government is doing and how they're perpetuating colonialism, and send off some emails that way and see what education we can get out there. Anybody can write an email and ask questions. It doesn't have to be perfectly composed. So I think there's a lot that we can do individually to find our own education, in addition to, of course, all the CUPE Steward Learning Series modules, I do believe are fantastic.
Thank you, Donna. I don't know if you have anything to add, Calvin, if you want to brave the vagaries of the internet. I think he's fine. I did also want to acknowledge that something I'm working on in my life is accessibility and making events more accessible. So I know in this event, there's no closed captioning, for example. So I apologize to members that may be watching this around or couldn't watch this because it wasn't accessible. So we all can learn and have work to do. I'm very grateful to people in my life who are disability activists who have taught me a lot, and just being very gentle around, hey, like this venue isn't gonna work, you know, like, can you change the venue? Can you guys get interpreters? So we all have to do that to make sure things are accessible. So I wanted to acknowledge that as well. We have another question here around what role can bargaining play in becoming an anti-racist local? So that's a deep one. I don't know who wants to take that to start with. So the question is, what role can bargaining play in becoming an anti-racist local? Donna, you're nodding, so I guess you're up.
I'm just nodding in agreement, not that I necessarily have the answers. I think bargaining can play an important role, though. I know we do have an article in our collective agreement that allows them to post positions that are for specific racialized workers. I think it's super important. As a steward and as an executive member, I definitely get to hear a lot from members who disagree with it. But as Calvin was saying earlier, when you have some of these schools, because I'm also in the education section, it's kind of funny, all four of us are in the education sector, but we have our students that are Black, and they need to see themselves represented. So I think it's important to have that language bargained in there so that they can post these positions. And I think respectful workplaces are not enough. I think you need to see if you can bargain more specific language around anti-racism, anti-Black racism, or marginalized workers in general. Again, we have to set the tone. We're the ones that need to start the conversation.
Yolanda, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's important that we also recognize like employment equity that we actually had in Ontario years ago, of course, then completely squashed in Canada. You know, for whatever reason it was squashed, I have my own myths in the back of my head that sometimes, you know, folks are afraid and aren't ready for change. But if we actually like make it a real priority, not just put it on paper, but do really good groundwork and working with the government on legislating employment equity back, I think that is like a key, because I talked about elections before and how important that is. And I think like while folks are out there like working with our legislative folks, I think bargaining employment equity is a bit that I talked about before in one of the questions that you asked me, into our collective agreements have to be a priority, because it's more grassroots, it's more like down to like sort of like the local level. I'm so glad, Donna, for the work that you're doing there. It is a tough one, but it has to be done. And to work with people to say, I mean, I'm from the largest school board with 13,000 members at the Toronto District School Board. And we have put that at the forefront of all of our bargaining. Of course, I'm not going to tell a lot of tales here. It has always made it to the last and then made it like off the table. It's sort of like you're bargaining with yourself by then, right? And because of that, it's been difficult to actually like see folks like me in all those other roles, you know? So I come from education, so they're in lunchroom. Like I'm talking about like the local level, not even like the union level. I'm talking about like lunchroom assistants look like me. They're precarious work. Like L. Jones, all the TAs in our schools are precarious workers, 2-3 jobs, they look like me, because we don't have a bargain. We don't have it like we have full-time jobs. We have qualified and skilled equity seekers that can do these full-time jobs and Black workers, but don't have the opportunity to actually get the work. And that definitely has to be a priority for us. Priority number one.
Calvin, did you have anything to add?
I do.
Oh.
And it was all working. I could see him moving, and then the minute he went to speak.
Take off your screen, Calvin.
Yeah,
Remove
try just
your
audio.
screen and just do your audio and see if that works. I mean, we want to see you, that's great, but I think it's better if you just try that.
Try just audio. So see if we can get you on audio.
How's
Okay.
that?
Try now.
Okay, so I'm really sorry about this. It's really embarrassing.
It's not embarrassing at all. It's computers.
No, as far as bargaining, like just everyone pretty much summed up pretty much what you need to do here. Like people need to be involved in any process, any public process that you want to change, any type of structures you want to try to disavow. You just need people to be involved with it. myself, I just started to become involved with the union probably 2 to 3 years ago in the Human Rights Committee. I never really looked at a union as something that I was going to be interested in, but looking around at the committees and going to the delegation and being a delegate to these conventions and seeing myself and people who look like me very vastly underrepresented in those places, it kind of hits hard. It hits hard. It's like, what can you do? Like, you need to have a voice. I'm usually not very vocal, but I'm becoming more vocal because it's a necessity for it. And if you have some ideas, if you have any type of input to share, do it. Speak up, be involved, and that's what my
Nice.
mission is now, as far as, you know, trying to help out union and talking to my fellow co-workers about the importance of union as well, and having a vote when it comes to certain things.
So thank you, Calvin. That worked a lot better. So we'll just have
The
to
video off.
keep you blanked out. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We have a couple of more questions. One I wanted to address that came into chat. I just figured out the chat. So part of it was answered around materials, but there's a really interesting piece also around the more subtleties of racism. This is something that Calvin was talking about, so that people understand that, like, saying the N-word is bad. Apparently everybody except this person at, you know, the CUPE National Convention, but the more subtle ways in which racism experienced. So they were curious about this. And we also have a similar question to that here. As a white male, I try to address equity-seeking issues, but I know I'm not close to understanding them from the life experience. How do we create a space that is welcoming, and how do we champion your issues? That's also a bit related. It's a separate question, but I think there's also some interest in this notion of unconscious bias, of subtle racism, polite racism. So how do people recognize racism once it gets beyond these kind of blatant expressions? So I don't know if people want to take that on and address that. And Calvin had talked about this already. No one?
Jean,
Say it one more time and I'll try to address it again.
We're not hearing Calvin.
I think Calvin asked you to repeat the question. He didn't quite hear your question.
I'm sorry. So the first part of the question is around recognizing unconscious bias, or polite racism, as they call it, which we know isn't very polite, but how do we recognize more subtle forms of racism? So people are sort of suggesting that they're not very confident in navigating that and recognizing or speaking out against it because they may not understand. So what are some of the tools for recognizing that, or being able to engage in less blatant forms of racism in terms of challenging it?
I guess when it comes to subtle forms of racism, given the fact and the climate of what's going on today, if you're a white person and you're in a situation and it doesn't feel right to you, it doesn't smell right to you, it doesn't taste right to you, you know something's wrong. Me as a black person, I have that, it's already ingrained in me where I feel it and smell it and taste it and know where it's coming to. As far as, you have to first acknowledge the fact that racism does exist and you have it in your heart. Like Donna said earlier, if you're educated, born, raised in North America, and gone through this educational system, you can't help but to be racist. Now it's up to you to unravel some of that racism with education and just acknowledging the fact that people of African descent have a certain feel. Like, you could walk in a room, like, and you could just pick out, I can speak for myself, I can just pick out certain feelings in certain people who may have issue with me just because of color of my skin, right? That's a subtle form. A white person, like I said, if it's going on today, what's happened today, you must have a feeling when you know something's not right, and acknowledge that feeling in your gut. That's one of the biggest things that I can say.
Yolanda, did you want to speak about that?
And I also want to add on, thanks, Galva. I think I want to add, like, it's okay to ask. You know, it's okay to talk to people. It's okay to be like, to come out to folks and just ask questions. It's the only way we're going to learn from each other.
Oh,
And, you know, even when people say things like I don't see color, like instead of me sort of thinking, really, I try to like then turn around that other voice now. And I say, I understand that you don't see color, but then talk about some historical events, or talk about like what's happening right now, or talk about some of the violence or some of the crime, or, right? And sort of, and connect the dots, and talk about, you know, historical things like the sleeping car porters and people coming to Canada, and, you know, like those, because then people start to nod their heads, and not to sort of like say, I can't believe this, or I can't believe you don't get it, or I can't believe you're not gonna like participate, or whatever. Systemic racism, for some, it takes time, and because it's in us, but sometimes we don't know what to call it or how to describe it, and we have it, and we don't really know what it is. I think that's it's not a time for us to like feel offended or be upset or be mad, but to share education and our knowledge.
And Donna, you may also have some thoughts here, particularly around this question. So this person asking from the position of a white man, what is that role? I think that question is sort of around, what is the role of white people? When are you overstepping your boundaries and speaking out? How do you balance centering Black voices and experiences versus, you know, white people taking on those responsibilities? I don't know if you have any answers to those kind of questions.
Sure. The big thing is, don't make it about you. If you go to a rally, if you go to something, don't be taking selfies and post them. Black folk are not there to be the background to show that you're a good person. Be a witness, be there to be a support. If what you're saying, or if you're posting, or if it perpetuates a stereotype, question it. Okay, is this real? Is this my bias coming into play? Because we may not be able to know our own biases, but we can all sit here and list stereotypes. So if it's perpetuating that stereotype, that might be a little trigger warning to say, this might be my bias. Let me look into this a little bit more. Also, like Yolanda was just saying, don't be offended. Don't be upset. It's not a time to be offended. If somebody calls me out, if somebody tells me that's racist, question it. Don't get defensive. I'm really going to go out on a limb here. We almost need to de-villainize the word racism, because me admitting I'm a racist doesn't make me a villain. It doesn't make me a bad person. It means I have learning to do. So if somebody calls me out, I don't get defensive, because I don't think that word makes me a horrible person. I think it means I need to learn. This is where I need to question. This is where I need to take someone else's perspective. You're going to mess up. As a white ally, you are going to mess up. As a society, we are growing, we're changing, evolving. Maya Angelou, when we know better, we do better. We have to know better first. So you're going to mess up. When you do, own it. Apologize. But an apology without change is manipulation. So apologize and then learn and go from there. But yeah, just own it. Don't be defensive, and be willing. And I guess, I don't know.
Well, that's great. I think it's also really important to understand, like, Black people are human beings. We're not asking for some kind of different treatment, like you have to believe that Black women are perfect. We're not perfect, and we don't want to be perfect. We're human beings too. But the difference is when our mistakes or shortcomings are treated not as human shortcomings, but as racial shortcomings. So, oh, we had a Black woman who worked here before, but she never got things in on time. So all Black people don't get things on time, or you're not getting it in on time because you know how you people are about timekeeping or something like that. So what happens when you're Black is that you become often a representative of the Black collective, and any behavior is put down to Blackness and represents all Black people. So there's a big difference between engaging with a person as a human being, in both the positive pieces and in the pieces that we all have as human beings that we need to work on, and seeing those as racial issues, which is different than being colorblind, right? We're not saying don't see race, but we're saying don't think that if I do something, it's because I'm Black and that's what Black people do. You know, Black people, like, they're not great workers or whatever. So there's a lot of putting down things that Black people do as though they represent the collective. And I think that's important. I think that really answered this next question around people's defensiveness around words like racist and bigot, not as a dialogue ender, but rather as a place to open conversation. I think we've addressed that. Yeah, people hear you're a bad person when they hear the word racist, rather than you're engaging in structures of oppression that exist throughout society and that we're all taught, including Black people who do a lot of work and have to do internal work to dismantle our own racism that we are taught around, who we are, what our value is, the value of the Black people. We're not born waving copies of Malcolm X either, right? We have done a lot of work too to learn about these issues. Our schools don't teach us these things either. So I always say, if Black people can do it, white people can do it. In the same way that we have to sit down and find books and we watch speeches and we read articles, those things are out there, and don't be afraid to engage in them. There's a really great essay by Audre Lorde, A-U-D-R-E, first name, last name Lorde, L-O-R-D-E, called The Uses of Anger, where she talks about the uselessness of guilt, right? That nobody needs you to feel guilty, and guilt is actually another form of really centering yourself. Oh, now I feel so bad. Nobody's asking you to feel bad or feel guilty or hate yourself because you're white, or be like, I can't help it if my ancestors this. Nobody's asking that. What people are asking is just that you recognize those positions, the things that worked on you, the things you learned. We all grew up in this society. We all learned the same things too. And then just be open to doing the work to dismantle them, again, as Black people do as well. So that's my contribution. I don't know if we have any other questions, or if we want to move to some final thoughts from each of the panelists, anything that we didn't cover. This is the chance for people asking questions to get in those last questions. Okay, can we perhaps get some final words from each panelist? Perhaps also one thing you'd like to see moving forward. So if you had to pick one thing that you think is a positive space for transformation, and then whatever other final thought that you might have. I'll start with Calvin.
I'll keep it short. Just validate our experiences and our existence. Listen to what we have to say, and try to move forward as a collective and make this a better place for everyone.
Donna?
Yeah, just, oh my gosh, there's so many thoughts going through my head that I can't even get it straight. For me, I just want to see it continue going forward. It's not even one specific thing. I just want to see the movement continue to go forward. And just from the bottom of my heart, I wanted to thank the three of you for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. It was very impactful for me, and hopefully it's carried that into some of the people watching as well.
We did get a quick last question that I'm just going to insert. I guess I'll answer it, but I'm not the final authority. There is a question around mental health, so the impact that experiencing racism has on mental health for Black people, and how we are affected by that. And that is particularly true in the workplace. There's many, many studies that show that racism actually is a mental health issue. Both the people that are racist and people experiencing racism, and there are serious health effects. So high blood pressure, higher rates of diabetes, much poorer health, those stress outcomes are very real and very much impact Black people. So Black people, yes, are very negatively affected by this. It is a form of ongoing trauma. And also, of course, when Black people are struggling, that is often read as aggression rather than the need for help. So for example, Black youth who are struggling with trauma also are often read as angry, aggressive, kicked out of school rather than getting help. So we often see in the workplace when a Black person is on stress leave or needs mental health help or is experiencing depression, that isn't read as a worker in need of support. It's read as, oh, you're being lazy and not coming to work, or, oh, you're being disruptive in the office. So it's very important to also, again, see Black people as human beings. One of the readings of Blackness that comes from enslavement is the idea that we're not fully human. We could be enslaved because we didn't feel the heat like white people, and we could work to death in the fields, and you could take our children from us because we didn't have the same love as everybody else. And those ideas still go through how we see Black people, whether that's the idea of the strong Black woman, right? Oh, Black woman is so strong. But when do we get to be weak? When do we get to be vulnerable? When do we get to cry? When do we get to say, I can't handle it, it's too much? So even things that can seem positive, like Black people are so strong, you guys take on so much, you just work so hard and never feel tired. We are people, and of course we feel tired and vulnerable, and of course those things affect us. So one of the ways that Black people is seen is often through this lens that actually then has a very poor impact on mental health. So understanding that when Black people are experiencing things, we're not having a bad attitude, we're actually suffering, and we need help and support is really important. So hopefully that answers some of those questions around mental health issues and the need for supports in the workplace and beyond as well. Saying that, Yolanda, I'm going to jump to you for your final comments.
Yeah, I want to thank the region, of course, again, for this opportunity for I think this is a great conversation. And I mean, it is a panel and it's a good panel, but I welcome discomfort and I welcome difficult conversations because we have to have them in order to grow and not feel like we're away, but a part of something. I think the last thing I think I would leave with folks is to make space for Black members and to continue, I'm going to say it again, to implement employment equity and take our claims of anti-Black racism right to arbitration. If we don't do the work and just talking about it and putting it on paper, but actually do it, then things won't change because we have so much to offer. And I think we should be included in all aspects of everybody's life. And that's why I'm not going to stop talking about employment equity. I'm not going to stop talking about anti-Black racism and the things we need to do to do that work. And so thank you for that. I'm going to continue working with CUPE in implementing employment equity and to help make that happen with our Education and Human Rights Department. I think those are things that I can leave folks with that are positive.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists for giving so much of yourselves, for speaking so honestly and showing so much humanity in doing that, so much generosity towards the panelists, towards each other, towards those listening, and really towards the broader society. And thank you, CUPE, for putting this on, for Nan, for Mary Dan doing technical support, and Dawn. So many people, I'm missing somebody, Dwayne, I believe as well. So many people who have come together to make this happen. So we really honor that. There's a lot of questions about resources, so I don't know if anyone in CUPE has a list that they might want to send out of things that might be mentioned. I'll add to that, a lot of people like Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. If you're interested in some of the images of Black people that persist, 13th is really helpful for understanding criminalization and the way that Black bodies are seen as a threat. That's a documentary, 13th, I'm saying it really fast, directed by Ava DuVernay. I said Ibram Kendi's How to Be a Racist. I find the work of Audre Lorde, Lorde last name, very, very helpful. Robin's book was mentioned, Desmond's book was mentioned. Until We Are Free, the Black Lives Matter book has a range of chapters on different experiences. Check out the Black Federal Workers Caucus. They have stuff online around specifically workplace racism, and there's a lot of work going on specifically addressing that. In terms of abolition and policing, Mariam Kabra's work, K-A-B-A as the last name, first name, M-A-R-I-A-M-E. Mariam Kabra's work is, of course, legendary. Ruthie Gilmore's work, of course, Angela Davis. So those are some resources that I can say off the top of my head. There's a lot of resources floating around right now. So if you go on and type in resources and abolition or 10 books you should read by Black women or something, hopefully you find a good list. But those are some things that I have, and there's a message that some resources will be posted on the webpage. So thank you everyone for listening, for